Jeeves and the Greasy Bird by P.G. Wodehouse. The shades of night were falling fairly fast as I latchkeyed self and suitcase into the Wooster GHQ. Jeeves was in the sitting room messing about with Holly, for we would soon be having Christmas at our throats, and he is always a stickler for doing the right thing. I gave him a cheery greeting. "Well, Jeeves, here I am, back again. Good evening, sir. Did you have a pleasant visit?" "Not too bad, but I'm glad to be home." "What was it the fellow said about home?" "If your allusion is to the American poet John Howard Payne, sir, he compared it to its advantage with pleasures and palaces. He called it sweet and said there was no place like it. And he wasn't so far out. Shrewd chap, John Howard Payne. I believe he gave uniform satisfaction, sir." I had just returned from a weekend at the Chuffnell Regis Clinic of Sir Roderick Glossop, the eminent loony doctor, or nerve specialist, as he prefers to call himself. Not, I may add, as a patient, but as a guest. My Aunt Dahlia's cousin Percy had recently put in there for repairs, and she had asked me to pop down and see how he was making out. He had got the idea, I don't know why, that he was being followed about by little men with black beards, a state of affairs which he naturally wished to have adjusted with all possible speed. "You know, Jeeves," I said some moments later, as I sat quaffing the whisky and S with which he had supplied me, "life's odd, you can't say it isn't. You never know where you are with it. There was some particular aspect of it that you had in mind, sir. I was thinking of me and Sir R. Glossop. Who would ever have thought the day would come when he and I would be hobnobbing like a couple of sailors on shore leave? There was a time, you probably remember, when he filled me with a nameless fear, and I leapt like a startled grasshopper at the sound of his name. You have not forgotten?" "No, sir. I recall that you viewed Sir Roderick with concern, and he me with ditto. Yes, sir, a stiffness certainly existed. There was no fusion between your souls, yet now our relations are as cordial as they can stick. The barriers that separated us have come down with a bump. Beam at him. He beams at me. He calls me Bertie. I call him Roddy. To put the thing in a nutshell, the dove of peace is in a rising market and may quite possibly go to par. Of course, like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, if I've got the names right, we pass through the furnace together, and that always for a bond. I was alluding to the time when, from motives I need not go into beyond saying that they were fundamentally sound, we had both blacked our faces, he with burned cork, I with boot polish, and had spent a night of terror wandering through Chuffnell Regis with no place to lay our heads, as the expression is. You don't remain on distant terms with somebody you've shared an experience like that with. "But I'll tell you something about Roddy Glossop, Jeeves," I said, having swallowed a rather grave swallow of the strengthening fluid. "He has something on his mind. Physically I found him in excellent shape. Few fiddles could have been fitter, but he was gloomy, distrait, brooding. Conversing with him, one felt that his thoughts were far away, and that those thoughts were stinkers. I could hardly get a word out of him. It made me feel like that fellow in the Bible who tried to charm the deaf adder and didn't get to first base. There was a blighter named Blair Eggleston there, and it may have been this that depressed him, for this Eggleston— Ever hear of him? He writes books." "Yes, sir. Mr. Eggleston is one of our angry young novelists. The critics describe his work as frank, forthright and fearless." "Oh, do they? Well, whatever his literary merits, he struck me as a fairly noxious specimen. What's he angry about?" "Life, sir. He disapproves of it." "So one would gather from his output, sir. Well, I disapproved of him, which makes us all square, but I don't think it was having him around that caused the Glossop gloom. I am convinced that the thing goes deeper than that. I believe it's something to do with his love life. I must mention that while at Chuffnell Regis, Pop Glossop, who was a widower with one daughter, had become betrothed to Myrtle, Lady Chuffnell, the aunt of my old crony Marmaduke, Chuffy Chuffnell, and that I should have found him still single more than a year later seemed strange to me. One would certainly have expected him by this time to have raised the price of a marriage licence and had the bishop and assistant clergy getting their noses down to it. A red-blooded loony doctor under the influence of the divine passion ought surely to have put the thing through months ago. Do you think they've had a row, Jeeves? Sir? Sir Roderick and Lady Chuffnell? Oh, no, sir. I am sure there is no diminution of affection on either side. Then why the snag? Her ladyship refuses to take part in the wedding ceremony, while Sir Roderick's daughter remains unmarried, sir. She has stated in set terms that nothing will induce her to share a home with Miss Glossop. This would naturally render Sir Roderick moody and despondent. A bright light flashed upon me. I saw all. As usual, Jeeves had got to the very heart of the matter. A thing that always bothers me when compiling these memoirs of mine is the problem of what steps to take when I bring on the stage a dramatis persona, as I believe the expression is, who has already appeared in some earlier instalment. Will the customers, I ask myself, remember him or her, or will they have completely forgotten her or him, in which case they will naturally want a few footnotes to put them abreast? This difficulty arises in regard to Honoria Glossop, who got into the act in what I suppose would be about Chapter 2 of the Wooster story. Some will recall her, but there may be those who will protest that they have never heard of the Beazle in their lives, so perhaps better be on the safe side and risk the displeasure of the blokes with good memories. Here, then, is what I recorded with ref to this H. Glossop at the time when, owing to circumstances over which I had no control, we had become engaged. Honoria Glossop, I wrote, was one of those large, strenuous, dynamic girls with the physique of a middleweight catch-as-catch-can wrestler and a laugh resembling the sound made by the Scotch Express going under a bridge. The effect she had on me was to make me slide into a cellar and lie low there till they blew the all clear. One could readily, therefore, understand the reluctance of Myrtle Lady Chuffnell to team up with Sir Roderick while the above was still a member of the home circle. The stand she had taken reflected great credit on her sturdy common sense, I considered. A thought struck me, the thought I so often have when Jeeves starts dishing the dirt. "How do you know all this, Jeeves?" "Did he confer with you?" I said, for I knew how wide his consulting practice was. "Put it up to Jeeves" is so much the slogan in my circle of acquaintance that it might be that even Sir Roderick Glossop, finding himself on a sticky wicket, had decided to place his affairs in his hands. Jeeves is like Sherlock Holmes. The highest in the land come to him with their problems. For all I know, they may give him jewelled snuff-boxes. It appeared that I had guessed wrong. "No, sir, I have not been honoured with Sir Roderick's confidence." "Then how did you find out about his spot of trouble? By extra whatever it's called? Extrasensory perception?" "No, sir. I happened to be glancing yesterday at the G section of the club book. I got the gist. Jeeves belongs to a butlers and valets club in Curzon Street called the Junior Ganymede, and they have a book there in which members are required to enter information about their employers. I remember how stunned I was when he told me one day that there are 11 pages about me in it. The data concerning Sir Roderick and the unfortunate situation in which he finds himself was supplied by Mr. Dobson." "Who?" "Sir Roderick's butler, sir." "Of course, yes," I said, recalling the dignified figure into whose palm I had pressed a couple of quid on leaving that morning. "But surely Sir Roderick didn't confide in him?" "No, sir, but Dobson's hearing is very acute, and it enabled him to learn the substance of conversations between Sir Roderick and her ladyship." "He listened at the keyhole?" "So one would be disposed to imagine, sir." I mused a while. So that was how the cookie crumbled. A pang of pity for the toad beneath the harrow whose affairs we were discussing passed through me. It would have been plain to a far duller auditor than Bertie Wooster that poor old Roddy was in a spot. I knew how deep was his affection and esteem for Chuffy's Aunt Myrtle. Even when he was liberally coated with burned cork that night at Chuffnell Regis, I had been able to detect the lovelight in his eyes as he spoke of her. And when I reflected how improbable it was that anyone would ever be ass enough to marry his daughter Honoria, thus making his path straight and ironing out the bugs in the scenario, my heart bled for him. I mentioned this to Jeeves. "Jeeves," I said, "my heart bleeds for Sir R. Glossop." "Yes, sir. Does your heart bleed for him?" "Profusely, sir, and nothing to be done about it. We are helpless to assist. One fears so, sir. Life can be very sad, Jeeves." "Extremely, sir." "I am not surprised that Blair Eggleston has taken a dislike to it." "No, sir. Perhaps you had better bring me another whisky and S to cheer me up, and after that I'll pop off to the drones for a bite to eat." He gave me an apologetic look. He does this by allowing one eyebrow to flicker for a moment. "I am sorry to say I have been remiss, sir. I inadvertently forgot to mention that Mrs. Travers is expecting you to entertain her to dinner here tonight, but isn't she at Brinkley?" "No, sir. She has temporarily left Brinkley Court and taken up residence at her townhouse in order to complete her Christmas shopping, and she wants me to give her dinner?" "That was the substance of her words to me on the telephone this morning, sir." My gloom lightened perceptibly. "This Mrs. Travers is my good and deserving Aunt Dahlia, with whom it is always a privilege and pleasure to chew the fat." I would be seeing her, of course, when I went to Brinkley for Christmas, but getting this preview was an added attraction. If anyone could take my mind off the sad case of Roddy Glossop, it was she. I looked forward to the reunion with bright anticipation. I little knew that she had a bombshell up her sleeve and would be touching it off under my trouser seat while the night was yet young. On these occasions when she comes to town and I give her dinner at the flat, there is always a good deal of gossip from Brinkley Court and neighbourhood to be got through before other subjects are broached, and she tends not to allow a nephew to get a word in edgeways. It wasn't till Jeeves had brought the coffee that any mention of Sir Roderick Glossop was made. Having lit a cigarette and sipped her first sip, she asked me how he was, and I gave her the same reply I had given Jeeves. In robust health, I said, but gloomy, sombre, moody, despondent. Just because you were there, or was there some other reason? He didn't tell me, I said guardedly. I always have to be very careful not to reveal my sources when Jeeves gives me information he has gleaned from the club book. The rules about preserving secrecy concerning its contents are frightfully strict at the Junior Ganymede. I don't know what happens to you if you're caught giving away inside stuff, but I should imagine that you get hauled up in a hollow square of valets and butlers and have your buttons snipped off before being formally bunged out of the institution. And it's a very comforting thought that such precautions are taken, for I should hate to think that there was any chance of those 11 pages about me receiving wide publicity. It's bad enough to know that a book like that, pure dynamite as you might say, is in existence. He didn't let me in on what was eating him. He just sat there being gloomy and despondent. The old relative laughed, one of those booming laughs of her, which in the days when she hunted with the Quorn and Pitesley probably lifted many a sportsman from the saddle. Her vocal delivery when amused always resembles one of those explosions in London Street you read about in the papers. Well, Percy had been with him for several weeks, and then you on top of Percy. Enough to blot the sunshine from any man's life. How is Percy, by the way? Quite himself again. A thing I wouldn't care to be, but no doubt it pleases him. Little men no longer following him around? If they are, they've shaved. He hasn't seen a black beard for quite a while, he tells me. That's good. Percy'll be all right if he rid himself of the idea that alcohol is a food. Well, we'll soon buck Glossop up when he comes to Brinkley for Christmas. Will he be there? He certainly will, and joy will be unconfined. We're going to have a real old-fashioned Christmas with all the trimmings, holly, mistletoe, yards of both, and a children's party complete with Santa Claus. With the vicar in the Stella roll? No, he's down with flu. The curate sprained his ankle. Then who are you going to get? Oh, I'll find someone. Was anyone else at Glossop's? Only a fellow of the name of Eggleston. Blair Eggleston, the writer? Yes, Jeeves tells me he writes books and articles. He's doing a series for me on the modern girl. For some years, helped out by doles from old Tom Travers, her husband, Aunt Dahlia, had been running a weekly paper for women called Milady's Boudoir, to which I once contributed a piece, as we journalists call it, on what the well-dressed man is wearing. The little sheet has since been sold, but at that time it was still limping along and losing its bit of money each week, a source of considerable spiritual agony to Uncle Tom, who had to foot the bills. He has the stuff in sackfuls, but he hates to part. "I'm sorry for that boy," said Aunt Dahlia. "For Blair Eggleston, why, he's in love with Honoria Glossop." "What?" I cried. She amazed me. I wouldn't have thought it could be done, and is too timid to tell her so. It's often that way with these frank, fearless young novelists. They're devils on paper, but put them up against a girl who doesn't come out of their fountain pen and their feet get as cold as a dachshund's nose. You'd think when you read his novels that Blair Eggleston was a menace to the sex and ought to be kept on a chain in the interests of pure womanhood, but is he? No, sir, he's just a rabbit. I don't know if he has ever actually found himself in an incense-scented boudoir, alone with a girl with sensual lips and dark smouldering eyes. But if he did, I'll bet he would take a chair as far away from her as possible and ask her if she had read any good books lately. "Why are you looking like a half-witted fish?" I was thinking of something. "What?" "Oh, just something," I said warily. Her character sketch of Blair Eggleston had given me one of those ideas I do so often get quick as a flash, but I didn't want to spill it till I'd had time to think it over and ponder on it. It never does to expose these brainwaves to the public eye before you've examined them every angle. "How do you know all this?" I said. He told me in a burst of confidence the other day when we were discussing his Modern Girl series. I suppose I must have one of those sympathetic personalities which invite confidences. "You will recall that you have always told me about your various love affairs. That's different in what way? Use the loaf, old flesh and blood. You're my aunt. A nephew naturally bears his soul to a loved aunt. I see what you mean. Yes, that makes sense. You do love me dearly, don't you? Like Billy-O? Always have. Well, I'm certainly glad to hear you say that. Well-deserved tribute. Because there's something I want you to do for me. Consider it done. I want you to play Santa Claus at my children's Christmas party." Should I have seen it coming? Possibly, but I hadn't, and I tottered where I sat. I was trembling like an aspen. I don't know if you've ever seen an aspen. I haven't myself as far as I can remember, but I knew they were noted for trembling like the Dickens. I uttered a sharp cry, and she said if I was going to sing, would I kindly do it elsewhere, as her eardrum was sensitive. "Don't say such things even in fun," I begged her. "I'm not joking." I gazed at her incredulously. "You seriously expect me to put on white whiskers and a padded stomach and go about saying, 'Ho, ho, ho,' to a bunch of kids as tough as those residing near your rural seat? They aren't tough. Pardon me, I've seen them in action. You will recollect that I was present at the recent school treat. You can't go by that. Naturally, they wouldn't have the Christmas spirit at a school treat in the middle of summer. You'll find them as mild as newborn lambs on Christmas Eve." I laughed a sharp, barking laugh. "I shan't." "Are you trying to tell me you won't do it?" "I am." She snorted emotionally and expressed the opinion that I was a worm. But a prudent, level-headed worm, I assured her. A worm who knows enough not to stick its neck out. "You really won't do it? Not for all the rice in China? Not to oblige a loved aunt? Not to oblige a posse of loved aunts? Now listen, young Bertie, you abysmal young blot." As I closed the front door behind her some 20 minutes later, I had rather the feeling you get when parting company with a tigress of the jungle, or one of those fiends with hatchets who are always going about slaying six. Normally the old relative is as genial a soul as ever downed a veal cutlet, but she's apt to get hot under the collar when thwarted. And in the course of the recent meal, as we have seen, I had been compelled to thwart her like a ton of bricks. It was with quite a few beads of perspiration bedewing the brow that I went back to the dining room where Jeeves was cleaning up the debris. "Jeeves," I said, brushing away the beads of perspiration with my cambric handkerchief, "you were off stage towards the end of dinner, but did you happen to drink in any of the conversation that was taking place?" "Oh, yes, sir. Your hearing, like Dobson's, is acute." "Extremely, sir. And Mrs. Travers has a robust voice." I received the impression that she was incensed. She was as sore as a gum boil. And why? Because I stoutly refused to portray Santa Claus at the Christmas orgy she is giving down at Brinkley for the children of the local yokels. So I gathered from her obiter dicta, sir. I suppose most of the things she called me were picked up on the hunting field in her hunting days. No doubt, sir. Members of the Quorn and Pitesley are not guarded in their speech. Very seldom, sir, I understand. Well, her efforts were— what's that word I've heard you use? Bootless, sir, or fruitless? Whichever you prefer, sir. I was not to be moved. I remained firm. I'm not a disobliging man, Jeeves. If somebody wanted me to play Hamlet, I would do my best to give satisfaction. But at dressing up in white whiskers and a synthetic stomach, I draw the line and draw it sharply. She huffed and puffed, as you heard, but she might have known that argument would be bootless. As the wise old saying has it, you can take a horse to the water, but you can't make it play Santa Claus. Very true, sir. You think I was justified in being adamant? Fully justified, sir. Thank you, Jeeves. I must say I thought it pretty decent of him to give the young master the weight of his support like this, for though I haven't mentioned it before, it was only a day or two since I had been compelled to thwart him as inflexibly as I had thwarted the recent aunt. He had been trying to get me to go to Florida after Christmas, handing out a lot of talk about how pleasant it would be for my many American friends, most of whom make a beeline for Hobe Sound in the winter months, to have me with them again, but I recognised this, though specious, as merely the old oil. I knew what was the thought behind his words. He likes the fishing in Florida and yearns some day to catch a tarpon. Well, I sympathised with his sporting aspirations and would have pushed them along if I could have managed it, but I particularly wanted to be in London for the Drones Club darts tournament, which takes place in February and which I confidently expected to win this year, so I said Florida was out, and they said, "Very good, sir," and that was that. The point I'm making is that there was no dudgeon or umbrage or anything of that sort on his part, as there would have been if he had been a lesser man, which of course he isn't. "And yet, Jeeves," I said, continuing to touch on the affair of the stricken aunt, though my firmness and resolution enabled me to emerge victorious from the battle of wills, I can't help feeling a pang. "Sir?" "Of remorse. It's always apt to gnaw you when you've crushed someone beneath the iron heel. You can't help thinking that you ought to do something to bind up the wounds and bring the sunshine back into the poor slob's life. I don't like the thought of Aunt Dahlia biting her pillow tonight and trying to choke back the rising sobs because I couldn't see my way to fulfilling her hopes and dreams. I think I should extend something in the way of an olive branch or amende honorable. It would be a graceful act, sir, so I'll blow a few bob on flowers for her. Would you mind nipping out tomorrow morning and purchasing, say, 24 long-stemmed roses? Certainly, sir. I think they'll make her face light up, don't you? Unquestionably, sir. I will attend to the matter immediately after breakfast. Thank you, Jeeves. I was smiling one of my subtle smiles as he left the room, for in the recent exchanges I had not been altogether frank, and it tickled me to think that he thought that I was merely trying to apply a soothing poultice to my conscience. Mark you, what I had said about wanting to do the square thing by the aged relative and heal the breach and all that sort of thing was perfectly true, but there was a lot more than that behind the gesture. It was imperative that I get her off the boil because her cooperation was essential to the success of a scheme or plan or plot which had been fizzing in the Wooster brain ever since the moment after dinner, when she had asked me why I was looking like a half-witted fish. It was a plan designed to bring about the happy ending for Sir R. Glossop, and now that I had had time to give it the once-over, it seemed to me that couldn't miss. Jeeves brought the blooms while I was in my bath, and having dried the frame and donned the upholstery and breakfasted and smoked a cigarette to put heart into me, I started off with them. I wasn't expecting a warm welcome from the old flesh and blood, which was lucky, because I didn't get one. She was at her haughtiest, and the look she gave me was the sort of look which in her Quorn and Pitesley days she would have given some fellow sportsman whom she had observed riding over hounds. "Oh, it's you," she said. Well, it was, of course, no argument about that, so I endorsed her view with a civil good morning and a smile, rather a weak smile probably, for her aspect was formidable. She was plainly sizzling. "I hope you thoroughly understand," she said, "that after your craven exhibition last night I'm not speaking to you." "Oh, aren't you?" "Certainly not. I'm treating you with silent contempt." "What's that you've got there?" "Some long-stemmed roses. For you." She sneered visibly. "You and your long-stemmed roses? It would take more than long-stemmed roses to change my view that you're a despicable cowardly custard and a disgrace to a proud family. Your ancestors fought in the Crusades and were often mentioned in dispatches, and you cringe like a salted snail at the thought appearing as Santa Claus before an audience of charming children who wouldn't hurt a fly. It's enough to make an aunt turn her face to the wall and give up the struggle. But perhaps," she said, her manner softening for a moment, "you've come to tell me you've changed your mind?" "I fear not, aged relative." "Then buzz off, and on your way home try, if possible, to get run over by a motor bus, and may I be there to hear you go pop." I saw that I had better come to the res without delay. "Aunt Dahlia," I said, "it is within your power to bring happiness and joy into a human life. If it's yours, I don't want to, not mine, Roddy Glossop's. Sit in with me in a plan or scheme which I have in mind, and he'll go pirouetting about his clinic like a lamb in springtime." She drew a sharp breath and eyed me keenly. "What's the time?" she asked. I consulted the wristwatch. 11:15. "Why? I was only thinking that it's very early for anyone, even you, to get pie-eyed." "I'm not pie-eyed." "Well, you're talking as if you were. Have you got a piece of chalk?" I tut-tutted impatiently. "Of course I haven't. Do you think I go about with pieces of chalk on my person? What do you want it for?" "I would like to draw a line on the carpet and see if you can walk along it, because it's being borne in upon me more emphatically every moment that you're stewed to the gills. Say, truly rural." I did so. And she stood at the door of Burgess's fish sauce shop, welcoming him in. Again, I passed the test. "Well," she said grudgingly, "you seem as sober as you ever are. What do you mean about bringing happiness and joy into old Glossop's life? The matter is susceptible of a ready explanation. I must begin by saying that Jeeves told me a story yesterday that shocked me to the core." "No," I said in answer to her query. "It was not the one about the young man of Calcutta. It had to do with Roddy's love life. It's a long story, but I'll condense it into a short, and I would like to stress before embarking on my narrative that you can rely on it being accurate, for when Jeeves tells you anything, it's like getting it straight from the mouth of the stable cat. Furthermore, it's substantiated by Mr. Dobson, Roddy's butler. You know Myrtle, Lady Chuffnell? I've met her. She and Roddy are betrothed, so I've heard. They love each other fondly, so what's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong. She stoutly declines to go centre aisling with him until his daughter Honoria gets married." I had expected this to make her sit up, and it did. For the first time, her demeanour conveyed the impression that she wasn't labelling my utterances as just delirious babble from the sick bed. She has always been fond of our Glossop, and it came as a shock to her to learn that he was so firmly established in the soup. I wouldn't say she turned pale, for after years of following the hounds in all weathers she can't, but she snorted, and I could see that she was deeply moved. "For heaven's sake, is this true? Jeeves has all the facts. Does Jeeves know everything?" "I believe so." "Well, you can understand Ma Chuffnell's attitude. If you were a bride, would you want to have Honoria a permanent resident of your little nest?" "I wouldn't." "Exactly. So, obviously steps must be taken by Roddy's friends and well-wishers to get her married. And that brings me to the nub. I have a scheme. I'll bet it's rotten. On the contrary, it's a ball of fire. It flashed on me last night when you were telling me that Blair Eggleston loves Honoria. That is where hope lies. You mean you're thinking that he will marry her and take her off the strength? Precisely, not a chance. I told you he was too much of a rabbit to suggest a merger. He'll never have the nerve to propose, unless helped by a push from behind. And who's going to give him that? I am, with your cooperation." She gave me another of those long, keen looks, and I could see that she was again asking herself if her favourite nephew wasn't steeped to the tonsils in the juice of the grape. Fearing more tests and further references to pieces of chalk, I hastened to explain. "Here's the idea. I start giving Honoria the rush of a lifetime. I lush her up at lunch and dinner. I take her to theatres and nightclubs. I haunt her like a family spectre and cling to her closer than a porous plaster." I thought I heard her mutter, "Poor girl," but I ignored the slur and continued. "You meanwhile, will you be seeing something of Eggleston? I see him daily. He brings me his latest views on the modern girl. Then the things in the bag. You say he has already confided in you about his warmer and deeper than ordinary friendship feelings concerning Honoria, so it won't be difficult for you to bring the subject up in the course of conversation. You warn in a motherly way that he's a sap if he goes on not telling his love and letting concealment like a worm in the bud feed in his damask cheek, one of Jeeves's gags. I thought he put it rather well, and stressed the fact that he had better heat up his feet and grab the girl while the grabbing's good, because you happen to know that your nephew Bertram is making a heavy play in her direction and may sew up the deal at any moment. Use sufficient eloquence, and I can't see how he can fail to respond. He'll be pouring out his love before you know where you are. And suppose she doesn't feel like getting engaged to him? Absurd! Why, she was once engaged to me." She was silent for a space, plunged in thought, as the expression is. "I'm not sure," she said at length, "that you haven't got something. It's a snip. Yes, I think you're right. Jeeves has a great brain. What's Jeeves got to do with it? Wasn't it his idea?" I drew myself up rather haughtily. Not an easy thing to do when you're sitting in an armchair. I resent this universal tendency to take it for granted that whenever I suggest some particularly ripe scheme, it must be Jeeves's. The sequence was entirely mine. Well, it's not at all a bad one. I've often said that you sometimes have lucid intervals, and you'll sit in and do your bit. It will be a pleasure. Fine. Can I use your phone? I want to ask Honoria Glossop to lunch. I should imagine that it has often been said of Bertie Wooster that when he sets his hand to the plough, he does not readily sheathe the sword. I had told Aunt Dahlia that I was going to give Honoria the rush of a lifetime, and the rush of a lifetime was precisely what I gave her. I lunched, dined, and on 2 occasions nightclubbed her. It ran into money, but you can put up with a few punches in the pocketbook when you're working in a good cause. Even when wincing at the figures at the foot of the bill, I was able to console myself with the thought of what all this was in aid of. Nor did I grudge the hours spent in the society of a girl whom in normal circumstances I would willingly have run a mile in tight shoes to avoid. Pop Glossop's happiness was at stake, and when a pal's happiness is at stake, the undersigned does not count the cost. Nor were my efforts bootless. Aunt Dahlia was always ringing me up to tell me that Blair Egglestone's temperature was rising steadily day by day, and it seemed to her only a question of time before the desired object would be achieved. And came a day when I was able to go to her with the gratifying news that the desired object had indeed been achieved. I found her engrossed in an eerie Stanley Gardner, but she lowered the volume courteously as I entered. "Well, Ugly," she said, "what brings you here? Why aren't you off somewhere with Honoria Glossop doing your South American Joe act? What's the idea of playing hooky like this?" I smiled one of my quiet smiles. "Aged relative," I said, "I've come to inform you that I think we have reached the end of the long, long trail," and without further preamble, I gave her the lowdown. "Have you been out today?" "I went for a stroll, yes. The weather probably struck you as extraordinarily mild for the latter part of December. More like spring than winter. You haven't come here to talk about the weather. You will find it is germane to the issue, because the afternoon was so balmy, like others I could name. I beg your pardon, I didn't speak. Go on." "Well, as it was such a nice day, I thought I would take a walk in the park. I did so, and blowed if the first thing I saw wasn't Honoria. She was sitting on a chair by the Serpentine. I was about to duck, but it was too late. She had seen me, so I had to heave alongside and chat. And suddenly who should come along but Blair Eggleston? I had enchained her interest. She uttered a yip. He saw you with the naked eye. Then that was your moment. If you'd had an ounce of sense, you'd have kissed her." I smiled, another of my quiet ones. "I did." "You did?" "Yes, sir." I folded her in a close embrace and let her have it. "And what did Eggleston say?" "I didn't wait to hear. I pushed off." "But you're sure he saw you?" "He couldn't have missed. He was only a yard or two away, and the visibility was good." It isn't often that I get unstinted praise from my late father's sister, she as a rule being my best friend and severest critic, but on this occasion she gave me a rave notice. It was a pleasure to listen to her. "That should have done it," she said, after handing me some stately compliments on my ingenuity and resource. "I saw Eggleston yesterday, and when I mentioned what fun you and Honoria were having going about together, he looked like a blonde Othello. His hands were clenched, his eyes burning, and if he wasn't grinding his teeth, I don't know a ground tooth when I hear one. That kiss was just what he needed to push him over the edge. He probably proposed to her the moment you were out of the way. That's how I had it figured out." "Oh, hell," said the old ancestor, for at this moment the telephone rang, interrupting us just when we wanted to go on discussing the thing undisturbed. She reached for it, and a long, one-sided conversation ensued. I say one-sided because her contribution to it consisted merely of ohs and whats. Eventually, whoever was at the other end appeared to have said his or her say, for she replaced the receiver and turned a grave face in my direction. "That was Honoria," she said. "Oh, really?" And what she had to tell me was fraught with interest. Did matters work out according to plan? Not altogether. How do you mean, not altogether? "Well, to begin with, it seems that Blair Eggleston, no doubt inflamed by what I told you I had said to him yesterday, proposed to her last night. He did, and was accepted. That's good. Not so good. Why not? Because when he saw you kiss her, he blew his top and broke the engagement. Oh, my God! Nor is that all. The worst is yet to come. She now says she's going to marry you. She said she quite realized your many defects, but is sure she can correct them and mould you. And though you aren't the mate of her dreams, she feels that your patient love should be rewarded. Obviously what happened was that you made yourself too fascinating. There was always that risk, I suppose." Long before she had concluded these remarks, I had gone into my Aspen act again. I goggled at her, stunned. "But this is frightful. I told you it wasn't so good. You aren't pulling my leg? No, it's official. Then what shall I do for the best?" She shrugged a moody shoulder. "Don't ask me," she said. "Consult Jeeves. He may be able to suggest something." Well, it was all very well to say consult Jeeves, but it wasn't as simple as she seemed to think. The way I looked at it was that to place him in possession of the facts in what you might call pitiless detail would come under the head of bandying a woman's name, which, as everybody knows, is the sort of thing that gets you kicked out of clubs and cut by the county. On the other hand, to be in a jam like this and not seek his counsel would be a loony proceeding. It was only after profound thought that I saw how the thing could be worked. I gave him a hail, and he presented himself with a courteous, "Sir?" "Oh, Jeeves," I said, "I hope I'm not interrupting you when you are curled up with your Spinoza's Ethics, or whatever it is. But I wonder if you could spare me a moment of your valuable time." "Certainly, sir. A problem has arisen in the life of a friend of mine who shall be nameless, and I want your advice. I must begin by saying that it's one of those delicate problems where not only my friend must be nameless, but all the other members of the personnel. In other words, I can't mention names. You see what I mean? I understand you perfectly, sir. You would prefer to term the protagonists A and B, or North and South? A and B is more customary, sir. Just as you say. Well, A is male, B female. You follow me so far? You have been lucidity itself, sir. And owing to, what's that something of circumstances you hear people talking about? Cats enter into it, if I remember rightly. Would concatenation be the word for which you are groping? I had to pause here for a moment to marshal my thoughts. Having done so, I proceeded. Now, until quite recently, B was engaged to... Shall we call him C, sir? Caesar's as good a name as any, I suppose. Well, as I was saying, until quite recently, B was engaged to Caesar and A hadn't a worry in the world. But now there has been a rift within the loot, the fixture has been scratched, and B is talking freely of teaming up with A, and what I want you to bend your brain to is the problem of how AA can oil out of it. Don't get the idea that it's simple, because A is what is known as a preux chevalier, and this hampers him. I mean, when B comes to him and says, A, I will be yours, he can't just reply, You will you? That's what you think. He has his code, and the code rules that he must kid her along and accept the situation. And frankly, Jeeves, he would rather be dead in a ditch. So there you are. The facts are before you. Anything stirring? Yes, sir. I was astounded. Experience has taught me that he generally knows all the answers, but this was certainly quick service. Say on, Jeeves. I'm all agog. Obviously, sir, B's matrimonial plans would be rendered null and void if A were to inform her that his affections were engaged elsewhere. But they aren't. It would be necessary merely to convey the impression that such was the case. I began to see what he was driving at. You mean if I, or rather A, were to produce some female and have her assert that she was betrothed to me, or I should him, the peril would be averted. Precisely, sir, I mused. It's a thought, I agreed, but there's the dickens of a snag, viz. How to get hold of the party of the second part. You can't rush about London asking girls to pretend they're engaged to you. At least I suppose you can, but it would be quite a nervous strain. That, sir, is the difficulty. You haven't an alternative plan to suggest? I fear not, sir. I confess I was baffled, but it's pretty generally recognised at the drones and elsewhere that while you can sometimes baffle Bertie Wooster for the nonce, he rarely stays baffled long. I happened to run into Catsmeat Potter Purbright at the drones that night, and I suddenly saw how the snag to which I had alluded could be got around. Catsmeat is on the stage and now in considerable demand for what are called juvenile roles. But in his early days he had been obliged, like all young hams, to go from agent to agent seeking employment, or trying to get a shop, as I believe the technical term is, and he was telling me anecdotes about them after dinner, and it struck me like a blow in the midriff that if you wanted a girl to exhibit as your fiancée, a theatrical agent was the very man to help you out. Such a bloke would be in an admirable position to supply some resting artiste who would be glad to sit in on an innocent deception in return for a moderate fee. Catsmeat had told me where these fauna were to be found. The Charing Cross Road is apparently where most of them hang out, and on the following morning I might have been observed entering the premises of Jas Waterbury on the top floor of a building about halfway up that thoroughfare. The reason my choice had fallen on Jas was not that I had heard glowing reports of him from every side. It was simply because all the other places I had tried had been full of guys and dolls standing bumper to bumper, and it hadn't seemed worthwhile waiting. Entering Jas Waterbury, I found his outer office completely empty. It was as if he had parted company with the human herd. It was possible, of course, that he had stepped across the road for a quick one, but it was also possible that he was lurking behind the door labelled private, so I rapped on it. I hadn't expected anything to start into life, but I was wrong. A head popped out. I've seen heads that were more of a feast for the eye. It was what I would describe as a greasy head. Its summit was moist with hair oil, and the face, too, suggested that its proprietor, after the morning shave, had thought fit to rub his cheeks with butter. But I'm a broad-minded man, and I had no objection to him being greasy, if he liked being greasy. Possibly, I felt, if I had had the privilege of meeting Kenneth Molyneux, Malcolm McCullen, Edmund Ogilvy and Horace Furnival, the other theatrical agents I'd visited, I would have found them greasy too. It may be that all theatrical agents are. I made a mental note to ask Catsmeat Potter Purbright about this. "Oh, hello, Cocky," said this oleaginous character, speaking thickly, for he was making an early lunch on what looked like a ham sandwich. "Something I can do for you? Jas Waterbury, that's me. You want a shop? I want a girl, don't we all? What's your line? Are you running a touring company?" "No, it's more like amateur theatricals." "Oh, those? Well, let's have the inside story." I had told myself that it would be embarrassing confiding one's intimate private affairs to a theatrical agent, and it was embarrassing, but I stiffened the upper lip and had at it. And as my narrative proceeded, it was borne in upon me that I had sized up Jas Waterbury all wrong. Misled by his appearance, I had assumed him to be one of those greasy birds who would be slow on the uptake and unable to get hep to the finer points. He proved to be both quick and intelligent. He punctuated my remarks with understanding nods, and when I had finished said I had come to the right man, for he had a niece called Trixie who would fill the bill to my complete satisfaction. The whole project, he said, was right up Trixie's street. If I placed myself in her hands, he added, the act must infallibly be a smash hit. It sounded good, but I pursed my lips a bit dubiously. I was asking myself if an uncle's love might not have made him give the above Trixie too enthusiastic a build-up. "You're sure," I said, "that this niece of yours would be equal to this rather testing job? It calls for considerable histrionic skill. Can she make her role convincing? She'll smother you with burning kisses if that's what you're worrying about." What I had in mind was more the dialogue. We don't want her blowing up in her lines. Don't you think we ought to get a seasoned professional? That's just what Trixie is. Been playing fairy queens in panto for years. Never got a shop in London owing to jealousy in high places. But ask them in Leeds and Wigan what they think of her. Ask them in Hull. Ask them in Huddersfield. I said I would, always provided I happened to come across them, and he carried on in a sort of ecstasy. This buxom belle, Leeds Evening Chronicle. A talented bit of all right. Hull Daily News. Beauty and dignity combined. Wigan Intelligencer. Don't you fret yourself, cocky. Trix'll give you your money's worth. And talking of that, how much does the part pay? I was thinking of a £5. Make it 10, right ho, or rather 15. That way you'll get every ounce of zest and cooperation. I was in no mood to haggle. Aunt Dahlia had rung up while I was breakfasting to tell me that Honoria Glossop had told her that she would be looking in on me at 4 o'clock, and it was imperative that the reception committee be on hand to greet her. I dished out the 15 quid and asked how soon he could get hold of his niece, as time was of the essence. He said her services would be at my disposal well ahead of 0 hour, and I said fine. "Give me a ring when it's all set," I said. "I'll be lunching at the Drones Club." This seemed to interest him quite a bit. "Drones Club, eh? You a member there? I've got some good friends at the Drones Club. You know a Mr. Widgeon? Freddie Widgeon? Yes, very well. And Mr. Prosser? Yes, I know Oofy Prosser. Give them my best if you see them. Nice lads, both. And now you can trot along and feed your face without a care in the world. I'll have contacted Trixie before you're halfway through your fish and chips." And I was called to the phone while having the after-luncheon coffee in the smoking room. It was, as I had anticipated, Jas Waterbury. "That you, cocky?" I said it was, and he said everything was under control. Trixie had been contacted and would be up and doing with a heart for any fate in good time for the rise of the curtain. What, he asked, was the address they were to come to? And I told him, and he said they would be there at 3:45 without fail. So that was all fixed, and I was full of kindly feelings towards Jas Waterbury as I made my way back to the smoking room. He was a man whom I would have hesitated to invite to come with me on a long walking tour, and I still felt that he would have been well advised to go easier on the grease as regarded both his hair and his person. But there was no getting away from it, that if circumstances rendered it necessary for you to plot plots, he was the ideal fellow to plot them with. During my absence from the smoking room, Catsmeat Potter Pirbright had taken the chair next to mine, and I lost no time in sounding him out on the subject of Jas Waterbury. "You remember you were telling me about theatrical agents, Catsmeat? Did you ever happen to come across one called Waterbury?" He pondered a while. "The name seems vaguely familiar. What does he look like?" "Nothing on earth. That doesn't place him. All theatrical agents look like nothing on earth. But it's odd that I seem to know the name. Waterbury, Waterbury? Ha! Is he a greasy bird? Very greasy? And is his first name Jas?" "That's right. Then I know the chap you mean. I never met him myself. I doubt if he was going at the time when I was hoofing it from agent to agent, but I've heard of him from Freddie Widgeon and Oofy Prosser." "Yes, he said they were friends of his." He'd revise that view if he could listen to them talking about him. Oofy in particular. Jazz Waterbury once chiselled him out of £2,000. I was amazed. He chiselled Oofy out of £2,000, I gasped, wondering if I could believe my ears. Oofy is the Drones Club millionaire, but it is well known that it's practically impossible to extract as much as 5 bob from him without using chloroform and a forceps. Dozens have tried it and failed. That's what Freddie Widgeon told me. Freddie says that once Jazz Waterbury enters your life, you can kiss at least a portion of your holdings goodbye. Has he taken anything off you? 15 quid. You're lucky it wasn't 1,500. If you're saying to yourself that these words of Catsmeat's must have left me uneasy and apprehensive, you are correct to the last drop. 3:45 found me pacing the Wooster carpet with furrowed brow. If it had been merely a matter of this grease-coated theatrical agent tapping Freddie Widgeon for a couple of bob, it would have been different. A child can tap Freddie. But when it came to him parting Oofy Prosser, a man in whose wallet moths nest and raise large families, from a colossal sum like £2,000 the brain reeled, and one sought in vain for an explanation. Yet so it was. Catsmeat said it was impossible to get the full story because every time Jazz's name was mentioned, Oofy just turned purple and spluttered. But the stark fact remained that Jazz's bank balance was that amount up, and Oofy's that amount down. And it made me feel like a fellow in a novel of suspense who suddenly realises that he's up against an octopus of crime and hasn't the foggiest how he's going to avoid the menacing tentacles. But it wasn't long before reason returned to its throne, and I saw that I'd been alarming myself unnecessarily. Nothing like that was going to happen to me. It might be that Jazz Waterbury would have a shot at luring me into some business venture with the ultimate aim of leaving me holding the baby, but if he did, he would find himself stymied by a firm nolle prosequi. So, to cut a long story short, by the time the front doorbell rang, Bertram was himself again. I answered the bell, for it was Jeeves's afternoon off. Once a week he downs tools and goes off to play bridge at the Junior Ganymede. I opened the door, and Jazz and his niece came in, and I stood gaping dumbly. For an instant you might say I was spellbound. Not having attended the performance of a pantomime since fairly early childhood, I had forgotten how substantial fairy queens were, and the sight of Trixie Waterbury was like a blow from a blunt instrument. A glance was enough to tell me why the dramatic critic of the Leeds Evening Chronicle had called her buxom. She stood about 5'9" in her short French vamps and bulged in every direction. Also the flashing eyes and the gleaming teeth. It was some moments before I was able to say good afternoon. "Afternoon," said Jazz Waterbury. He looked about him approvingly. "Nice little place you've got here. Costs a packet to keep up, I'll bet. This is Mr. Wooster, Trixie. You call him Bertie?" The Fairy Queen said, "Wouldn't Sweetie Pie be better?" And Jazz Waterbury told her with a good deal of enthusiasm that she was quite right. "Much more box office," he agreed. "Didn't I say she would be right for the part, Cocky? You can rely on her to give a smooth West End performance. When do you expect your lady friend?" "Any moment now. Then we'd better be dressing the stage. Discovered you sitting in that chair there with Trixie on your lap." "What?" He seemed to sense the consternation in my voice, for he frowned a little under the grease. "We're all working for the good of the show," he reminded me austerely. "You want the scene to carry conviction, and there's nothing like a sight gag." I could see there was much in what he said. This was not time for half measures. I sat down. I don't say I sat blithely, but I sat, and Wigan's favourite fairy queen descended on my lap with a bump that made the stout chair tremble like an aspen, and scarcely had she started to nestle when the doorbell rang. "Curtain going up," said Jazz Waterbury. "Let's have the passionate embrace, Trixie, and make it good." She made it good, and I felt like a Swiss mountaineer engulfed by an avalanche smelling of patchouli. Jas Waterbury flung wide the gates, and who should come in but Blair Eggleton, the last caller I was expecting. He stood goggling. I sat goggling. Jas Waterbury goggled too. One could understand how he was feeling, anticipating the entrance of the female star and observing coming on left-centre a character who wasn't a member of the cast at all. He was pardonably disconcerted. No impresario likes that sort of thing. I was the first to speak. After all, I was the host, and it was for me to get the conversation going. "Oh, hello, Eggleston," I said. "Come along in. I don't think you've met Mr. Waterbury, have you?" "Mr. Eggleston, Mr. Jas Waterbury, and his niece, Miss Trixie Waterbury, my fiancée." "Your what?" "Fiancée. Betrothed. Affianced." Good Lord. Jas Waterbury appeared to be feeling that as the act had been shot to pieces like this, there was no sense in hanging around. "Well, Trix," he said, "your Bertie'll be wanting to talk to his gentleman friend, so give him a kiss and we'll be getting along. Pleased to have met you, Mr. What-is-it?" And with a greasy smile he led the Fairy Queen from the room. Blair Eggleston seemed still at a loss. He looked at the door through which they had passed, as if asking himself if he had really seen what he thought he had seen, then turned to me with the air of one who intends to demand an explanation. "What's all this, Wooster? What's all what? Eggleston, be more explicit. Who on earth is that female? Weren't you listening? My fiancée? You're really engaged to her?" "That's right. Who is she?" "She plays Fairy Queens in pantomime. Not in London owing to jealousy in high places, but they think a lot of her in Leeds, Wigan, Hull and Huddersfield. The critic of the Hull Daily News describes her as a talented bit of all right." He was silent for a space, appearing to be turning this over in his mind. Then he spoke in the frank, forthright and fearless way these modern novelists have. "She looks like a hippopotamus." I conceded this. There is a resemblance, perhaps. I suppose Fairy Queens have to be stoutish if they are to keep faith with their public in towns like Leeds and Huddersfield. Those audiences up north want lots for their money, and she exudes a horrible scent which I am unable at the moment to identify. "Patchouli, yes, I noticed that," he mused again. "I can't get over you being engaged to her." "Well, I am? It's official?" "Absolutely." "Well, this will be great news for Honoria." I didn't get his drift. "For Honoria?" "Yes, it will relieve her mind. She was very worried about you, poor child. That's why I'm here. I came to break it to you that she can never be yours. She's going to marry me." I stared at him. My first impression was that even though the hour was only about 4:30, he was under the influence of alcoholic stimulants. But I learned from a usually reliable source that that was all off. It was, but now it's on again. We have had a complete reconciliation. Well, fancy that. And she shrank from coming and telling you herself. She said she couldn't bear to see the awful dumb agony in your eyes. When I tell her you're engaged, she'll go singing about the West End of London, not only because of the relief of knowing that she hasn't wrecked your life, but because she'll be feeling what a merciful escape she's had. Just imagine being married to you. It doesn't bear thinking of. "Well, I'll be going along and telling her the good news," he said, and took his departure. A moment later the bell rang. I opened the door and found him on the mat. "What?" he asked. "Was that name again?" "Name? Your fiancée's? Trixie Waterbury?" "Good God!" he said, and pushed off. And I returned to the reverie he had interrupted. There was a time when if somebody had come to me and said, "Mr. Wooster, I have been commissioned by a prominent firm of publishers to write your biography, and I need some intimate stuff which only you can supply." Looking back, what would you consider the high spot in your career? I would have had no difficulty in slipping him the info. It occurred I would have replied in my 14th year when I was a resident pupil at Malvern House, Bramley-on-Sea, the private school conducted by that prince of stinkers, Aubrey Upjohn, M.A. He had told me to present myself in his study on the following morning, which always meant 6 of the juiciest with a cane that bit like a serpent and stung like an adder, and blowed if, when morning came, I wasn't all over pink spots. I had contracted measles, and the painful interview was of course postponed sine die, as the expressions. That had always been my supreme moment. Only now was I experiencing to an even greater extent the feeling of quiet happiness which comes to you when you've outsmarted the powers of darkness. I felt as if a great weight had been lifted off me. Well, it had, of course, in one sense, for the Fairy Queen must have clocked in at fully £160 ringside. But what I mean is that a colossal burden had been removed from the Wooster soul. It was as though the storm clouds had called it a day, and the sun come smiling through. The only thing that kept the moment from being absolutely perfect was that Jeeves was not there to share my hour of triumph. I toyed with the idea of ringing him up at the Junior Ganymede, but I didn't want to interrupt him when he was probably in the act of doubling 6 no trumps. The thought of Aunt Dahlia presented itself. She, of all people, should be the one to hear the good news, for she was very fond of Roddy Glossop, and had shown herself deeply concerned when informed of his in-the-soupness. Furthermore, she could scarcely not be relieved to learn that a loved nephew had escaped the fate that is worse than death, viz. Marrying Honoria. It was true that my firm refusal to play Santa Claus at her children's party must still be rankling, if that's the word, but at our last meeting I had found her far less incandescent than she had been. So there was reason to suppose that if I looked in on her now, I should get a cordial reception. Well, not absolutely cordial, perhaps, but something near enough to it. So I left a note for Jeeves saying where I'd gone and hared off to her address in a swift taxi. It was as I had anticipated. I don't say her face lit up when she saw me, but she didn't throw her Perry Mason at me, and she called me no new names, and after I had told my story, she was all joviality and enthusiasm. We were saying what a wonderful Christmas present the latest development would be for Pop Glossop, and speculating as to what it would feel like being married to his daughter Honoria, and, for the matter of that, being married to Blair Eggleston, and we had just agreed that both Honoria and Blair had it coming to them, when the telephone rang. The instrument was on a table near her chair, and she reached for it. "Hello!" she boomed. "Who, or rather who, for when at the telephone her vocal delivery is always of much the same calibre as it used to be on the hunting field." She handed me the receiver. "One of your foul friends wants you. Says his name's Waterbury." Jas Waterbury, placed in communication with self, seemed perplexed. In rather an awed voice he asked, "Where are you, Cocky? At the zoo? I don't follow you, Jas Waterbury." A lion just roared at me. "Oh, that was my aunt, sooner yours than mine." I thought the top of my head had come off. She has a robust voice, I'll say she has. "Well, Cully, I'm sorry I had to disturb her at feeding time, but I thought you'd like to know that Trix and I have been talking it over, and we both think a simple wedding at the registrar's would be best. No need for a lot of fuss and expense, and she says she'd like Brighton for the honeymoon. She's always been fond of Brighton." I was at something of a loss to know what on earth he was talking about, but reading between the lines, I gathered that the Fairy Queen was thinking of getting married. I asked if this was so, and he chuckled greasily. "Always kidding, Bertie. You will have your joke. If you don't know she's going to get married, who does? I haven't a notion." "Who to?" "Why, you, of course. Didn't you introduce her to your gentleman friend as your fiancée?" I lost no time in putting him straight. "But that was just a ruse. Surely you explained it to her." "Explained what?" "That I just wanted her to pretend that we were engaged. What an extraordinary idea. What would I have done that for? 15 quid. "I don't remember any 15 quid. As I recall it, you came to me and told me you'd seen Trixie as the Fairy Queen in Cinderella at the Wigan Hippodrome and fallen in love with her at first sight, as so many young fellows have done. You had found out somehow that she was my niece, and you asked me to bring her to your address. And the moment we came in, I could see the love light in your eyes, and the love light was in her eyes too, and it wasn't 5 minutes after that you'd got her on your lap, and there you were, as snug as two bugs in a rug. Just a case of love at first sight, and I don't mind telling you it touched me. I like to see the young folks getting together in springtime. Not that it's springtime now, but the principle's the same." At this point Aunt Dahlia, who had been simmering gently, intervened to call me a derogatory name and ask what the hell was going on. I waved her down with an imperious hand. I needed every ounce of concentration to cope with this misunderstanding, which seemed to have arisen. "You're talking through your hat, Jas Waterbury." "Who, me?" "Yes, you. You've got your facts all wrong. You think so, do you?" "I do, and I will trouble you to break it to Miss Waterbury that those wedding bells will not ring out. That's what I was telling you. Trixie wants it to be at the registrar's." "Well, that registrar won't ring out either." He said I amazed him. "You don't want to marry Trixie?" "I wouldn't marry her with a 10-foot pole." An astonished Lord Love-a-Duck came over the wire. "If that isn't the most remarkable coincidence," he said. "Those were the very words Mr. Prosser used when refusing to marry another niece of mine after announcing his betrothal before witnesses, same as you did. Shows what a small world it is. I asked him if he hadn't ever heard of breach of promise cases, and he shook visibly and swallowed once or twice. Then he looked me in the eye and said, 'How much?' I didn't get his meaning at first, and then it suddenly flashed on me. 'Oh, you mean you want to break the engagement,' I said, 'and feel it's your duty as a gentleman to see that the poor girl gets her bit of heart balm,' I said. 'Well, it'll have to be something substantial,' I said, 'because there's her despair and desolation to be taken into account.' So we talked it over and eventually settled on 2,000 quid, and that's what I'd advise in your case. I think I can talk Trixie into accepting that. Nothing, mind you, can ever make life anything but a dreary desert for her after losing you. But 2,000 quid would help." "Bertie!" said Aunt Dahlia. "Ah?" said Jas Waterbury. "There's that lion again. Well, I'll leave you to think it over. I'll come and see you tomorrow and get your decision, and if you feel that you don't like writing that cheque, I'll ask a friend of mine to try what he can do to persuade you. He's an all-in wrestler of the name of Porky Jupp. I used to manage him at one time. He's retired now because he broke a fellow's spine, and for some reason that gave him a distaste for the game. But he's still in wonderful condition. You ought to see him crack Brazil nuts with his fingers. He thinks the world of me, and there's nothing he wouldn't do for me. Suppose, for instance, somebody had done me down in a business transaction. Porky would spring to the task of plucking him limb from limb, like some innocent little child doing she loves me not with a daisy. Good night, said Jas Waterbury, and rang off. I would have preferred, of course, after this exceedingly unpleasant conversation, to have gone off into a quiet corner somewhere and sat there with my head between my hands, reviewing the situation from every angle, but Aunt Dahlia was now making her desire for explanatory notes so manifest that I had to give her my attention. In a broken voice I supplied her with the facts and was surprised and touched to find her sympathetic and understanding. It's often this way with the female sex. They put you through it in no uncertain manner if you won't see eye to eye with them in the matter. To take an instance at random, of disguising yourself in white whiskers and stomach padding, but if they see you are really up against it, their hearts melt, rancour is forgotten, and they do all they can to give you a shot in the arm. It was so with the aged relative. Having expressed the opinion that I was the king of the fatheads and ought never to be allowed out without a nurse, she continued in gentler strain, but after all you are my brother's son, whom I frequently dandled on my knee as a baby, and a subhuman baby you were if ever I saw one, though I suppose you were to be pitied rather than censured if you looked like a cross between a poached egg and a ventriloquist's dummy. so I can't let you sink in the soup without a trace. I must rally round and lend a hand. Well, thanks, old flesh and blood. Awfully decent of you to want to assist, but what can you do? Nothing by myself, perhaps, but I can confer with Jeeves, and between us we ought to think of something. Ring him up and tell him to come here at once. He won't be home yet. He's playing bridge at his club. Give him a buzz, anyway. I did so, and was surprised when I heard a measured voice say, "Mr. Wooster's residence." "Why, hello, Jeeves," I said. "I didn't expect you to be home so early." "I left in advance of my usual hour, sir. I did not find my bridge game enjoyable." "Bad cards?" "No, sir. The hands dealt to me were uniformly satisfactory, but I was twice taken out of business doubles, and I had not the heart to continue. Too bad." "So you're at a loose end at the moment?" "Yes, sir." "Then will you hasten to Aunt Dahlia's place?" "You are sorely needed." "Very good, sir." "Is he coming?" said Aunt Dahlia. "Like the wind, just looking for his bowler hat." "Then you pop off. You don't want me for the conference?" "No." "3 heads are better than 2, I argued. "Not if one of them is solid ivory from the neck up," said the aged relative, reverting to something more like her customary form. I slept fitfully that night, my slumbers much disturbed by dreams of being chased across country by a pack of fairy queens with Jas Waterbury galloping after them, shouting "Yoicks" and "Tally-ho." It was past 11 when I presented myself at the breakfast table. "I take it, Jeeves," I said as I started to pick at a moody fried egg, "that Aunt Dahlia has told you all?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Travers was most informative." "Well, that was a relief in a way, because all that secrecy and A and B stuff is always a strain. Disaster looms, wouldn't you say? Certainly your predicament is one of some gravity, sir. I can't face a breach of promise action with a crowded court giving me the horse's laugh and the jury mulcting. Is it mulcting? Yes, sir, you are quite correct. And the jury mulcting me in heavy damages. I wouldn't be able to show my face in the drones again. The publicity would certainly not be agreeable, sir. On the other hand, I thoroughly dislike the idea of paying Jas Waterbury £2,000. I can appreciate your dilemma, sir. But perhaps you have already thought of some terrific scheme for foiling Jas and bringing his greasy hairs in sorrow to the grave. What do you plan to do when he calls? I shall attempt to reason with him, sir. The heart turned to lead in the bosom. I suppose I've become so used to having Jeeves wave his magic wand and knock the stuffing out of the stickiest crises that I expect him to produce something brilliant from the hat every time, and though never at my brightest at breakfast, I could see that what he was proposing to do was far from being what Jas Waterbury would have called box office. Reason with him, forsooth. To reason successfully with that king of the twisters, one would need brass knuckles and a stocking full of sand. There was reproach in my voice as I asked him if that was the best he could do. "You do not think highly of the idea, sir?" "Well, I don't want to hurt your feelings." "Not at all, sir. But I wouldn't call it one of your top thoughts." "I am sorry, sir. Nevertheless—" I leaped from the table, the fried egg frozen on my lips. The front doorbell had given tongue. I don't know if my eyes actually rolled as I gazed at Jeeves, but I should think it extremely likely, for the sound had got in amongst me like the touching off an ounce or so of trinitrotoluol. "There he is. Presumably, sir. I can't face him as early in the morning as this. One appreciates your emotion, sir. It might be advisable if you were to conceal yourself while I conduct the negotiations. Behind the piano suggests itself as a suitable locale. How right you are, Jeeves. To say that I found it comfortable behind the piano would be to give my public a totally erroneous impression, but I secured privacy, and privacy was just what I was after. The facilities, too, for keeping in touch with what was going on in the great world outside were excellent. I heard the door opening and then Jas Waterbury's voice. "Morning, Cocky. Good morning, sir. Wooster in?" "No, sir, he has just stepped out. That's odd. He was expecting me." "You are Mr. Waterbury? That's me. Where's he gone?" "I think it was Mr. Wooster's intention to visit his pawnbroker, sir." "What? He mentioned something to me about doing so. He said he hoped to raise, as he expressed it, a few pounds on his watch. You're kidding. What's he want to pop his watch for? His means are extremely straitened. There was what I've heard called a pregnant silence. I took it that Jas Waterbury was taking time off to allow this to sink in. I wished I could have joined in the conversation, for I would have liked to say, "Jeeves, you are on the right lines," and offer him an apology for ever having doubted him. I might have known that when he said he was going to reason with Jas, he had the ace up his sleeve, which makes all the difference. It was some little time before Jas Waterbury spoke, and when he did, his voice had a sort of tremolo in it, as if he'd begun to realise that life wasn't the thing of roses and sunshine he'd been thinking it. I knew how he must be feeling. There is no anguish like that of the man who, supposing that he has found the pot of gold behind the rainbow, suddenly learns from an authoritative source that he hasn't, if you know what I mean. To him until now, Bertie Wooster had been a careless scatterer of 15 quids, a thing you can't do if you haven't a solid bank balance behind you, and to have him presented to him as a popper of watches must have made the iron enter into his soul if he had one. He spoke as if stunned. "But what about this place of his?" "Sir, you don't get a Park Lane flat for nothing." "No, indeed, sir, let alone a valet." "Sir, you're a valet, aren't you?" "No, sir. I was at one time a gentleman's personal gentleman, but at the moment I am not employed in that capacity. I represent Messrs. Allsop and Wilson, wine merchants, goods supplied to the value of £304, 15 shillings and 8pence, a bill which Mr. Wooster finds it far beyond his fiscal means to settle. I am what is technically known as the man in possession." A hoarse "Gorblimey" burst from Jas's lips. I thought it rather creditable of him that he did not say anything stronger. "You mean you're a broker's man?" "Precisely, sir. I'm sorry to say I've come down in the world, and my present situation was the only one I could secure. But while not what I have been accustomed to, it has its compensations. Mr. Wooster is a very agreeable young gentleman, and takes my intrusion in an amiable spirit. We have long and interesting conversations, and in the course of these he has confided his financial position to me. It appears that he is entirely dependent on the bounty of his aunt, a Mrs. Travers, a lady of uncertain temper who has several times threatened, unless he curbs his extravagance, to cancel his allowance and send him to Canada to subsist on a small monthly remittance. She is, of course, under the impression that I am Mr. Wooster's personal attendant. Should she learn of my official status, I do not like to envisage the outcome, though, if I may venture on a pleasantry, it would be a case of outgo rather than outcome for Mr. Wooster. There was another pregnant silence, occupied, I should imagine, by Jas Waterbury in wiping his brow, which one presumes had by this time become wet with honest sweat. Finally, he once more said, "Gorblimey." Whether or not he would have amplified the remark I cannot say, for his words, if he had intended uttering any, were dashed from his lips. There was a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and a loud snort informed me that Aunt Dahlia was with us. In letting Jas Waterbury in, Jeeves must have omitted to close the front door. "Jeeves!" she boomed. "Can you look me in the face?" "Certainly, madam, if you wish." "Well, I'm surprised you can. You must have the gall of an army mule. I've just found out that you're a broker's man in valet's clothing. Can you deny it?" "No, madam, I represent Messrs. Allsop and Wilson, wines, spirits and liqueurs supplied to the value of £304, 15 shillings and 8pence. The piano, behind which I cowered, hummed like a dynamo as the aged relative unshipped a second snort. Good God, what does young Bertie do? Bathe in the stuff? £304, 15 shillings and 8pence. Probably owes as much too in a dozen other places, and in the red to that extent he's planning, I hear, to marry the fat woman in a circus, a portrayer of fairy queens in pantomime, madam, just as bad. Blair Eggleston says she looks like a hippopotamus. I couldn't see him, of course, but I imagined Jas Waterbury drew himself to his full height at this description of a loved niece, for his voice when he spoke was stiff and offended. "That's my Trixie you're talking about, and he's going to marry her or else get sued for breach of promise. It's just a guess, but I think Aunt Dahlia must have drawn herself to her full height too. Well, she'll have to go to Canada to bring her action," she thundered, "because that's where Bertie Wooster will be off to on the next boat, and when he's there he won't have money to fritter away on breach of promise cases. It'll be as much as he can manage to keep body and soul together on what I'm going to allow him. If he gets a meat meal every third day, he'll be lucky. You tell that Trixie of yours to forget Bertie and go and marry the Demon King. Experience has taught me that, except in vital matters like playing Santa Claus at children's parties, it's impossible to defy Aunt Dahlia, and apparently Jas Waterbury realised this, for a moment later I heard the front door slam. He had gone without a cry. "So that's that," said Aunt Dahlia. "These emotional scenes take it out of one, Jeeves. Can you get me a drop of something sustaining?" "Certainly, madam. How was I, all right?" "Superb, madam. I think I was in good voice. Very sonorous, madam." "Well, it's nice to think our efforts were crowned with success. This will relieve young Bertie's mind. I use the word mind loosely. When do you expect him back?" "Mr. Wooster is in residence, madam." Shrinking from confronting Mr. Waterbury, he prudently concealed himself. "You will find him behind the piano." I was already emerging, and my first act was to pay them both a marked tribute. Jeeves accepted it gracefully, Aunt Dahlia with another of those snorts. Having snorted, she spoke as follows. "Easy enough for you to hand out the soft soap, but what I'd like to see is less guff and more action. If you were really grateful, you would play Santa Claus at my Christmas party." I could see her point. It was well taken. I clenched the hands. I set the jaw. I made the great decision. "Very well, aged relative. You will?" "I will. That's my boy. What's there to be afraid of? The worst those kids will do is rub chocolate eclairs on your whiskers." "Chocolate eclairs," I said in a low voice. "Or strawberry jam. It's a tribal custom. Pay no attention, by the way, to stories you may have heard of them setting fire to the curate's beard last year. It was purely accidental." I had begun to go into my Aspen act when Jeeves spoke. "Pardon me, madam." "Yes, Jeeves." "If I might offer the suggestion, I think that perhaps a maturer artist than Mr. Wooster would give a more convincing performance. Don't tell me you're thinking of volunteering?" "No, madam. The artist I had in mind was Sir Roderick Glossop. Sir Roderick has a fine presence and a somewhat deeper voice than Mr. Wooster. His ho-ho-ho would be more dramatically effective, and I am sure that if you approached him, you could persuade him to undertake the role." "Considering," I said, putting in my oar, "that he is always blacking up his face with burned cork." "Precisely, sir. This will make a nice change." Aunt Dahlia pondered. "I believe you're right, Jeeves," she said at length. "It's tough on those children, for it means robbing them of the biggest laugh they've ever had, but they can't expect life to be one round of pleasure. Well, I don't think I'll have that drink after all. It's a bit early." She buzzed off, and I turned to Jeeves, deeply moved. He had saved me from an ordeal at the thought of which the flesh crept, for I hadn't believed for a moment the aged R's story of the blaze in the curate's beard having been an accident. The younger element had probably sat up nights planning it out. "Jeeves," I said, "you were saying something not long ago about going to Florida after Christmas. It was merely a suggestion, sir. You want to catch a tarpon, do you not?" "I confess that it is my ambition, sir." I sighed. It wasn't so much that it pained me to think of some tarpon, perhaps a wife and mother, being jerked from the society of its loved ones on the end of a hook. What gashed me like a knife was the thought of missing the Drones Club darts tournament, for which I would have been a snip this year. But what would you? I fought down my regret. "Then will you be booking the tickets?" "Very good, sir. I struck a graver note. "Heaven help the tarpon that tries to pit its feeble cunning against you, Jeeves," I said. "Its efforts will be bootless."